Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have you all here. This is a very exciting thing that we do, our little book, our Bester's book discussion. So I want to I'm going through the script that Rabbi Shankman sent me. I want to make sure I get it right. We want to thank the Jewish Book Council for making this morning's conversation possible. And we encourage all of you to purchase the book either at a local bookstore or through our Mitzvah Mall, WHC Mitzvah Mall. And I've already posted the link, but let me post it again for all of you. There you go. And so a few things, just a few housekeeping rules, which you're already aware of, I'm sure, because you participate in these so often. Please keep yourself muted during the program. If you have any questions, you are welcome to send them to me, and I can pose them to our guest when we get to that part of the talk. And I'll try to do my best to include as many of the questions as possible. We also do have a list of questions that were sent to me in advance. And so with that, I would like to welcome Michelle Cameron to our book club this morning. She is the author of Napoleon's Mirage, and I just posted that, and I will continue to post it throughout the chat. I'll post it in the chat throughout our chat. So a little bit of information about Michelle. Her first historical novel, The Fruit of Her Hands, The Story of Shira of Ashkenaz, was published back in 2009. It is based on the life of Michelle's 13th century ancestor, Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, a renowned Jewish scholar of medieval Europe. And this is a richly dramatic fictional story of Rabbi Meir's wife, Shira, a devout but religious woman who preserves her religious traditions as she and her family witness the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. So then Michelle went on to author the prequel to Napoleon's Mirage, Beyond the Ghetto Gates. This was published in April 2020 and was awarded a silver medal in the historical fiction category by the Independent Book Publishers. And it won first place, Best of Category, for the Chanticleer Goethe Awards, and was also a finalist in the 2020 Forward Indies. Michelle then authored Babylon, a novel of Jewish exile and return, and it was published in September 2023, and she won a gold medal in the Flaubert, and Michelle, you can correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, Flaubert Ancient World category in the Historical Fiction Company's 2024 Book of the Year contest. And it was also a finalist in the 2024 Next Generation Indie Book Awards in the Religious Fiction category. So Napoleon's Mirage, which is the book we're going to discuss today, is Michelle's fourth historical novel. And prior to turning to the genre of historical novels, Michelle wrote In the Shadow of the Globe, which was named the Shakespeare Theater of New Jersey's 2003-04 Winter Book Selection, and it was also turned into a performance piece. Michelle is the director of the Writers Circle, which offers creative writing workshops and events to kids and adults in Summit, South Orange, Maplewood, Verona, and Morristown, New Jersey, as well as online. And she teaches novel classes to adults and creative writing classes to children and teens in Summit, New Jersey, and virtually. So we welcome her. She lives with her husband, and she has 2 grown sons, something I will never have until my daughters marry. All right, so we turn to Michelle.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you all for welcoming me here today. And I really appreciate the fact that, the Jewish Book Council was able to give you that choice and that you made that choice. So that's very special. So, and thank you, Cantor, for that, very detailed background about me. As you can see here, these are my 4 Jewish historical novels, which is the genre after, In the Shadow of the Globe. I wrote The Fruit of Her Hands, and it is very much the genre that I am now living in. I do want to just say one thing, that Babylon actually was written after The Fruit of Her Hands, but was published much later. And this is the vicissitudes of publishing, that it languished for many, many years, but I always knew it would be published. So I do also want to say that my historical fiction is largely about periods of Jewish history that very few people know anything at all about. And that's become my sweet spot, and I think will continue to be my sweet spot as I write the next books. Writing this book as a Napoleon's Mirage as a sequel was a completely new challenge for me. I had never before written a sequel, and I knew that I wanted Napoleon's Mirage to also be a standalone novel. And I believe, based on readers who read Napoleon's Mirage first, that I've actually accomplished that. I did this by going back and looking at other authors and their sequels and how they managed to do the kind of forward motion that you need to really interest any reader, and yet give enough detail about the previous book that my readers would not feel lost. So that, was very much a new challenge for me. And it ends up being a new challenge for me when I present anything at all about Napoleon's Mirage, because I don't know. I never assume, and I was mentioning this before, I never assume that people, in these groups have actually read the books before I come and talk to them. But there's also the complication that I don't know if anyone has read the previous book as well. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about Beyond the Ghetto Gates, giving you just enough information so that it will make sense out of my comments on Napoleon's Mirage. In Beyond the Ghetto Gates, Napoleon Bonaparte is a 26-year-old general of the Revolutionary French Army, and he is on a military campaign through Italy when he discovers in the city of Ancona, Italy, and you see that city here, that the Jews were locked behind ghetto gates from sundown to sunup each day. And he sent his soldiers to demolish the gates and liberate the Jews. This, of course, has a tremendous impact on both Jews and Catholics of Ancona. And as we read the book, we learn that two of Napoleon's soldiers, a Jewish soldier, Daniel, and a lapsed Catholic, Christoph, both fall in love with a young Jewish girl, Morel de Ancona. Her father manages a ketubah, Jewish marriage certificate, workshop. Morel herself of course, makes the wrong choice, because how else would you have a good romance, and becomes infatuated with Christoph. And despite her betrothal to the richest man in Ancona, she actually sleeps with Christoph. That's a lot more to the novel, but that's basically what you need to know as we pick up the threads in the story of Napoleon's Mirage. A year has passed. Christoph and Morel recognize that they are infatuated, not in love, and they have decided in Beyond the Ghetto Gates not to marry. So Morel is now managing her dead father's ketubah workshop, despite the fact that she's gotten disapproval from her mother, the city rabbi, and her erstwhile best friend Dolce, who has been jealous of the fact that Daniel rejected her advances because he was in love with Morella. Morel. So she is doing her best to ruin Morel financially by using her tainted reputation against her. Daniel and Christoph at this point are part of Napoleon's massive naval expedition heading toward an unknown destination. So we read this as the novel begins. "Do we know where we're headed yet, sir?" Sebastian asked. Daniel shook his head. "Best kept secret in the army." Sebastian laughed. "In any army at any time." He paused, thinking, if it weren't that Bonaparte is in command. And yet, despite the mystery, there wasn't a murmur of protest from the men, particularly not from the veterans of Bonaparte's victorious army of Italy. Still, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, where was such a huge fleet with so many thousands of soldiers be heading? That destination turns out to be Egypt. Napoleon has brought more than 150 savants, scientists, mathematicians, architects, archaeologists, and artists together with him on this journey. In the novel, in addition to a lot of the characters we've grown to love, I hope, in Beyond the Ghetto Gates, we're introduced to some new characters, including the Egyptian Muslim El-Jabarte, who in real life wrote about the French occupation of Egypt, Chaim Farhi, a Jew who in real life served as the secretary for the Mamluk warrior who defeated Napoleon in Akko, and the fictional Ethan, whose knowledge of languages makes him useful in spying for Napoleon. As you can tell, there are tons of twists and turns in this novel. I really enjoyed writing the romantic elements in the book. And I have to say that while this is not a romance, there are, of course, romantic elements. When Morel, who has now recognized her love for Daniel, is a continent apart from him, she writes to him, hinting at her desire to be wed. A well-bred girl of that age could never say that openly. But she does write, "Dolce is doing her best to spite me in any way she can. It's evident why. Despite her betrothal to a man from Florence, she's jealous, Daniel, angry that you did not return her regard, and jealous of us. Does she have reason to be? That's the question that renders me sleepless at nights, the question I wish you would answer. For unbecoming and immodest as it is for me to commit my feelings to paper, to confess without waiting for your declaration, if in fact you intend to make one, I truly hope she does have reason for her jealousy." Receiving this letter, Daniel is over the moon, ecstatic. But then suddenly the Battle of the Nile happens. And the French lose that battle to the British, and the resulting British blockade prevents Daniel from responding to her. Now, I had a long-distance relationship myself in my 20s. And this was, as we were discussing actually earlier, before the advent of email, chat, or text. I experienced enough of the longing for physical letters because phone calls at that point in time were far too expensive, to be able to relate to the young lover's frustration. And of course, it was particularly frightening for Morel, who could only interpret Daniel's silence as either indifference, his turning to someone else, or, the worst possibility yet, his death in a battle. He was, after all, a soldier. And after all, Napoleon's troops were facing a foe that did not necessarily follow European rules of combat. There is a great deal of violence and bloodshed in what I like to call my anti-war war novel. It's through Daniel's character's arc that we see just how destructive and, yes, pointless the several battles in this book turn out to be. Daniel, who leapfrogged to lieutenant status in Beyond the Ghetto Gates because he worked as part of Napoleon's propaganda machine, printing the general's newspapers, has to learn how to lead his artillery unit. He's unsure of himself, realizing that his soldiers do not respect his authority. But slowly he begins to gain confidence, as shown in this passage when they attack Maltese knights. Napoleon, on his way to Egypt, makes a slight detour in Malta. The next day, Daniel and his men were loaded into a chaloupe and put ashore to overpower the night defenders. As always, action steadied him. He hid his relief as he commanded his men for the first time in battle, realizing he did know what orders to give. One moment in particular stayed with him, making him flush with pride as he recalled it. He positioned the light cannon they brought with them in a small dip in the rock face of the shore. Pierre had protested the order, but Daniel shook his head. He had a particular target in mind, the cannon the knights had placed at the top of the tower, which was raining grape shot down at the French forces, causing them to shy back. A few seconds later, they had destroyed the enemy cannon, allowing their forces to surge forward. However, when his soldiers abandoned their cannon in Jaffa to pillage and rape, mainly because the city did not surrender according to European military custom, his orders to his men go disregarded. Appalled at the violence, Daniel tried to control his men. "Stop," he called as they abandoned their cannon and began to clamber over the broken walls. "That's an order." "No, sir," Pierre retorted as the rest of the men ignored Daniel's command and, arming themselves, moved forward into the city. "You can court-martial us if you'd like, but we're heading in." The hero worship that Daniel felt for his commander back in Italy during Beyond the Ghetto Gates dissipates, and he begins to question Napoleon's blind ambition and the multiple mistakes that the general makes, from marching his troops across the desert in wool uniforms and no water, to slaughtering Muslim soldiers despite a truce, to deciding to poison his own soldiers who have contracted bubonic plague. We will get back to that last shocking fact in a bit. Napoleon, who won the hearts of the Jews of Italy, clearly did not have the same impact on the Muslims of Egypt. You have to understand that he was nothing if not an opportunist when it came to religion. In fact, he declared himself and his soldiers in a proclamation as adherents of Islam, only to be met with indifference and ridicule and scorn, both by his troops and by the indigenous people of Egypt. One of my goals in writing this novel was to portray the Egyptian side of the conflict accurately. As noted earlier, I was not only able to rely on Napoleon in Egypt, El-Jabarti's Chronicle of the French Occupation, but also to create a fictional character out of the real-life Abd el-Rahman al-Jabarti. Many of his fictional reports to Chaim Farhi, as far as I know, the two men never met, and certainly never corresponded, mirrored his perceptions of the French from that book. So this includes the following. None of these non-believers have the sense or courtesy to remove their shoes or sandals when they enter a room. These Frenchmen are filthy. There's no other word for it. They make their water and defecate in the streets and gardens, not even wiping themselves, or worse still, using paper made sacred by writing. I have to say that I could never myself have come up with these words and this description if it weren't for the fact that they came almost exactly from El-Jabarti's chronicle. And it is definitely the advantage of being a historical novelist that you can pull from all of this research. Now, among the issues that writers face today are accusations of cultural appropriation. And as a Jewish author, I certainly wanted to avoid that when I was talking about the Muslims and the Mamelukes. But, you know, frankly, how else could I have written a well-rounded historical novel about war in Egypt without including Muslim characters? I did my homework, of course, but I also hired an Egyptian Muslim sensitivity reader from Sultan Sage, a company that specializes in sensitivity readings. I was grateful to learn that due to my homework, I'd made very few mistakes when describing Muslim ritual. And the sensitivity reader even went so far as to correct the small snippets of Arabic that I included to flavor the language. Having lived through a plague, as we all have, writing about the bubonic plague that infected so many of Napoleon's soldiers was definitely an interesting exercise. Morel's old lover, Christophe, would witness Napoleon's intrepid visit to the St. Nicholas Monastery in Jaffa, which would become the subject of the famous French painting, Bonaparte Visiting the Plague Victims of Jaffa, painted in 1804 by Anton Jean Gros. Like so many paintings where Napoleon is featured, this portrait of the general touching one of the buboes of a sick soldier was undoubtedly intended to show his heroic side, and possibly, probably, didn't actually occur. One of the savants who accompanied Napoleon and who becomes a character in the book, the artist Dominique Vivant Denon, advised Gros on the composition of the painting. But since Mirage is fiction, I decided to use the painting as if it were in fact. And during that visit, Christophe would be bedeviled by flies, which did, of course, carry the plague, and would barely survive. Another reason why the painting was made was to combat the suspicion that Napoleon, retreating back to Cairo after his defeat in Akko, and he was handed his first significant military defeat there, he ordered that the soldiers lying sick in the Jaffa monastery be poisoned using opium, so he would not have to transport them back to Egypt, a difficult and expensive undertaking. Nor did he want to leave them there to be slaughtered by Mameluke forces. According to rumor, Dr. Desgenites, shown here, the chief medical officer of the campaign, refused to poison the men, arguing with Napoleon about it. Napoleon shrugged. If I were in their place, I would think it a favor to be mercifully dispatched. Don't you have enough opium to do the job? The doctor looked horrified. I do not. And as far as I'm concerned, my duty is to preserve life, not take it. He turned on his heel and stalked down the beach. One of the most rewarding aspects of writing this book, unlike most of my others, was that I was able to visit the Israeli half of Napoleon's campaign, seeing the monasteries in Jaffa and on Mount Carmel, where his sick and injured soldiers were treated, the twisting stone steps in Jaffa, where the French pillaged the city after it refused to surrender, the battlements above the sea in Akko, where Napoleon was defeated, still complete with the cannon that Daniel and his soldiers would have used. And even totally unexpectedly, during a walk through Akko's market, to suddenly see a plaque on the home of Chaim Farhi, who, despite being a Jew, served the Mameluke warrior, Jazar Pasha, nicknamed the Butcher, who in fact mutilated Farhi, costing him an eye and even a nose. Jazar Pasha would defeat Napoleon, with Farhi being instrumental in planning that defeat. Before the battle in Akko, Ethan was ordered to give Jazar Pasha a letter from Napoleon, and Al-Jabarti, learning of this, said the following: "The man's a monster. He's vicious in war, but it's the duty of any good soldier to be ruthless in war. It's his private life that's horrifying." Is it so bad? Ethan schooled his face to remain nonchalant. He wouldn't let this Egyptian see his sudden trepidation. It is hideous monstrosities. He bricks up enemies in the walls of Akko to die a slow, agonizing death. He has an advisor, Chaim Farhi, whom he has maimed, carving off his nose and eye. He kills his wives when they anger him. And worst of all for you, he has a scimitar he keeps on hand for messengers whose news displeases him. So the real question while Napoleon likely did order the poisoning of his soldiers in Jaffa, it was a contingent of Turkish soldiers who would wipe out the Frenchmen recuperating from battle wounds in the Stella Maris monastery on Mount Carmel. Visiting that monastery, I saw the monument pictured here, commemorating the French soldiers who were slaughtered in that place. All right, so this is probably, of all of my Jewish historical novels, the one with the least Jewish aspect to it, despite the fact that many of my characters are Jewish. But there is one part of the novel that is very specifically Jewish, and that is the question whether Napoleon really did issue a proclamation to the Jews while in Egypt and Israel, offering them a homeland in return for their support against the Mamelukes. This possibility, this historic possibility, remains contentious. I based my decision to claim that it did happen due to newspaper reports at the time. Inaccurate as many of them were, there were, they noted that for example, that Bonaparte has published a proclamation to the Jews dispersed in Africa and Asia, inviting them to restore the kingdom of Jerusalem, as you can see here. There were also similar proclamations that Napoleon made to the other peoples of Egypt, including the Copts. But not everybody believes that this is historically accurate. And I was taking part in a virtual panel at the Napoleonic Historical Society talking about Beyond the Ghetto Gates when I was asked what I planned to write next. And I mentioned Napoleon's proclamation to the Jews. There was an instant argument by two historians, each one taking the opposite side. One saying that we don't have enough proof that this in fact did happen, while the other said, no, we have enough. And so, it was very interesting listening to them, especially the historian who did not believe it, because I was able, based on his arguments, to figure out fictional reasons why it might have happened and why there was as little proof as there is. So the book, as I said earlier, is not a romance, but it does have romantic elements to it. Now, while I don't want to give away the novel's ending, because I hope those of you who haven't read it are going to race out and buy it, or, I will tell you that the obstacles of distance and communication are eventually overcome. Though I feel obligated to warn you that not everything ends happily ever after. All right. Thank you so much for your attention. And I will be happy to answer any questions you might have, either about this novel or any of my others, what I like to call the writing life, about what I'm writing now, and even about the difficulties that Jewish authors are having in this current prejudicial climate. And so I am going to stop sharing at this point so I can talk to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. And just so we all have it, I'm going to once again place the link to Napoleon's Mirage in the chat. And you can purchasing it through this link is buying it through Washington Hebrew's Mitzvah Mall. So it benefits Washington Hebrew as well to purchase it through this link. So beautiful. So I have some questions that Bonnie and Mara sent to me prior. So we can start with those. And if anyone has a specific question that you'd like me to ask, please pose it to me. You can just put it to me in the chat and we'll get those going as well. We'll just start with this first question. So you've written obviously several Jewish historical novels that I mentioned in your bio at the beginning. Can you tell us what got you started on this literary path, especially when we note that you did not start on the historical novel path?
Okay, no, great question. So I actually, when I wrote In the Shadow of the Globe, I like to say there's no Jewish because I didn't deal with Merchant of Venice. There's no Jewish content in that book at all. It was actually the form that I thought I was going to become wedded to as a writer, which is a poetic verse novel. And so I was looking for another project, and I was thinking of writing about the woman I was named for, my great aunt. And I was looking for information in a genealogy that one of my cousins actually produced about the family. And at the very beginning was a small snippet about Mayor of Rothenburg, which got me interested. And as usual, when I'm interested in something, I will go and I will start doing the research because I love research. So I looked him up and I said, this guy is fascinating. I should write a verse novel about him. Well, the book didn't want to be a verse novel. The book wanted to be a fully fleshed out historical novel. And so when I finally stopped struggling against what the book wanted and wrote it, I said, this is where I need to be. I love poetry, but I'm really a storyteller. So after writing that book, there was a piece in that book about Babylon that fascinated me, and I started doing the research. And so I went and at that point, as I said, wrote Babylon. And then I said, you know, Jewish history is bleak and it's tough. And so I said, I need to find a happy moment in Jewish history to write about. And that is when I stumbled across the book Emancipation by Michael Goldfarb, which described Napoleon coming to Ancona, seeing the Jews locked behind the ghetto gates, and sending his soldiers to demolish them. And so that is what set me off on writing both this book as well as Napoleon's Mirage. So at this point, I feel very well wedded to, my choice to write about Jewish historical fiction. Again, from the point of view of picking up um, periods of time that very few people know about. And so that's kind of what I see my career trajectory continuing with.
Beautiful. And with that answer, you also answered a little bit about why you are focusing on Napoleon and his campaigns as well. But you stuck with that with this second book, Napoleon's Mirage. What led you to want to write a sequel?
I think the sequel came about, first of all, because at the end of Beyond the Ghetto Gates, I had not resolved the romance that I started there.
Mhm.
But in actual fact, I always thought that this was going to be a trilogy. And I wrote an earlier book about the Jews during the French Revolution, which actually includes Ethan, who shows up in Napoleon's Mirage. And I literally wrote an entire novel, and when I finished it, I said, no, this doesn't work. I couldn't find the story for it, which is why I went then to go to Beyond the Ghetto Gates. So the sequel really should have been part of a trilogy. I doubt I'm going to go back and fix that first book, but it's always a possibility.
Beautiful, beautiful. Um, in your research, did you come up with any reason why you think Napoleon um, found interest in protecting the Jews?
So I have theories about it. And my theory is one of the things that Napoleon was very constant in wanting to do was to show himself to be a very heroic character. He wanted to portray himself like that to the French people. And during the French Revolution, the Jews actually received citizenship for the first time in Europe in any country for millennia. So I believe that his initial instinct was to further the ideals of the French Revolution, and thereby showing himself to be this heroic character. I will say that later on, after he becomes emperor, he becomes a little bit disenchanted with the Jewish people because his initial instinct was if I give them, you know, all these rights and citizenship and help them with their religion, they'll become Catholics or Christians or secular.
Mhm.
And when that didn't happen, I think he was a little bit disappointed.
Thank you. So turning from Napoleon and these specific historical novels that you've been writing, can you tell us a little bit about how you go about doing research, a little bit about your writing process, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. So, I learned my lesson back when I wrote the novel that I wrote before In the Shadow of the Globe. I write a lot of novels that never see the light of day, and generally I'm really happy about that. But I spent nearly 10 years researching. And I realized that if I ever wanted to become an author with many books, I couldn't do that. So I sort of devised my method, which is I spent 3 months specifically on research. And in that research, I find my story. And my story has to come out of what happened to the time, but also what I can make out of what happened during the time that is a compelling narrative. Once I've finished those 3 months, and that includes finding events, finding what could have happened, creating timelines, making copious notes, that's when I start the writing process. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm not researching every day, because you can't write a book like this one and not end up finding something you don't know about as you're writing. But it's a much briefer, let me start with Google and then let me go back to the books that I have behind me or my notes and find the end. So yeah, but I am researching all the way through the revision process. But after those 3 months, I'm actually creating the story.
Mhm. Beautiful. And then when you're writing, do you set aside a certain amount of time every day? Do you have any special things you do? I know I heard once that Roald Dahl used to stop mid-sentence when he was finished at the end of the day, so that when he went back the next day, and like mid-paragraph, so that when he went back the next day, the creative juices could start
Would
flowing
would keep
immediately.
going.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great story. Um, I When I was writing The Fruit of Her Hands, I was holding down a full-time job and I had kids and I was, just as busy as any young mother. And I wasn't finding time to write. And it was when I went to a program called Finishing Your Novel, and the facilitator said, "All right, why are you not finishing?" And I explained all of this. And she figured out, she asked me, are you an early bird or, and I said, I'm definitely an early bird. And she said, great. Okay, I have two questions for you. The first is, how much do you want it? And the second is, how early can you get up? And so for about 5 years, I got up at 4:30 in the morning to write for 2 hours. And it was marvelous. This was the days before social media. My kids were asleep. My husband was asleep. I'd go down, I'd get my coffee, I'd bring it back, and I'd write for 2 hours. I don't do that anymore. Sometimes I regret not doing it anymore. But these days I have, as a director of the Writers Circle, I'm a partner in this with my business partner, and we're both novelists. So I am able to tell her that I'm in the middle of a scene, go away, and she'll actually do it. There are definitely times when I still can't get to writing, but I'm a huge believer that you need at least 10 minutes a day to keep the story in the front of your mind. Because if you wait too long, it goes somewhere in the back and you have to pull it forward to get back into it.
What is it like to teach the writing skill and to run the writers circle?
So first of all, I'm very fortunate that I have had 7 of my novelists, my adult novelists, have published in one way or another. And I'm so proud of that. I love the teaching aspect of it. First of all, it solidifies what I know, but I don't know, if you know what I mean. And it helps me when I come to my own writing and say, you just taught that. Apply those principles, you'll be fine. Um, I also really, really love teaching the kids. They, especially the younger ones, frankly, are so have no boundaries on their creativity. So I'll throw out a prompt or something, and then suddenly they'll bring me back something which is leagues above what I could with my adult brain ever have thought of. And it's just so much fun. So I love it, and it's very inspiring to do that.
That's wonderful. Having a young daughter, well, she's not young anymore, she's actually an adult now, um, who's a writer. I know that having um, professors and mentors who
Yeah.
are able to guide you and give you prompts and encourage you to write it are so helpful.
Yes.
Um, what has it been like to write novels that have Jewish aspects to them, and then further, as a Jewish writer yourself, what is it, with the state of the world and anti-Semitism on the rise, how have Jewish writers been affected?
So for me, for a while, I talked a little bit about cultural appropriation. Um, People are often surprised to find that, I'm a Reformed Jew. I'm not particularly observant. Um, but these are my stories. This is my history. And so I feel like it's I'm going to use these terrible hashtag own voices for me to write these stories. And I'm fascinated by it. I was fortunate, to finish high school in Israel and to have a teacher of Jewish history who was unbelievable and gave me so much grounding in, what I do with my work today. So that's been a huge advantage. Um, it is very difficult to be a Jewish author today. Um, there were definitely, when Babylon came out, it came out right before the war. And Babylon, because it's a biblical story, I had really hoped to have it be an interfaith book, to be able to go not just to synagogues, been to a lot of synagogues, but to go to churches, to talk about our common, you know, common heritage in terms of this. And I had set a couple of these up. And in both cases, very, very kind clergy came back to me and said, we can't do it now. We cannot do it now. And that was really hard because again, I had hoped that through discussion, we would come to some sort of understanding of one another. I think my last name, Cameron, has shielded me from a lot of what has happened to other authors that I know. And I have to say, it should be Cohen. And this is my father-in-law's fault. He served in the Navy. He hit a lot of anti-Semitism. And when he came back, he realized he was going into business. So he changed the family name. Um, but I have really good friends who have had their books on Amazon. People have given them 1-star ratings. A whole gang of people have given them 1-star ratings because they're writing about Jewish subjects. My publisher for Babylon wanted to put an ad in for a French philosopher, Bernard Levi, I think his name is. He's a very famous French philosopher. And the ad was not accepted because it had the word Israel in it. There's, obviously there have been many, many of my friends who have had to back out of events because of the problems or experienced, at larger conventions, experienced problems, while they're trying to speak and have been shouted down. So it is a very difficult time. Oh, and one more thing. A good friend of mine keeps a list of all of the literary publications that won't take work from someone who is Zionist. They won't accept it. And so it's pretty hard out there right now.
That's difficult to hear, and I'm sure very difficult to manage.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Um, so to more fun topics then. um, where do you get your ideas for your books, and what are you working on next?
So, as I said, my ideas pretty much come from whatever research I'm interested in.
Mhm.
Um, it's I can't think of a single novel that I've written that hasn't started with either a web search or a book that I've read or something like that. Um, so that's pretty much me. It's not that I don't have original ideas, but they all come out of the fact, the historical fact. Um, what I'm writing next. I was going to write the true story of the Maccabees. And the Maccabees were not the heroes we all think they were. Um, you know, so I was sort of engaged in that. I'd actually gone to Modi'in in Israel. They have this marvelous new museum there if you ever get over there and want to see it. And I was a number of chapters in when the war happened. And the war happened, and I realized I could not write about the Maccabees at this moment, and certainly not the book I intended to write. So I was thinking, what do I do now? And a number of friends of mine in a Jewish writers group, in fact, on Facebook, started talking about, at the very beginning, who would hide us if we had to be hidden? Did you have someone? And so I started thinking about that. And then I started thinking about Shakespeare because I still love Shakespeare. And so I considered and started looking up. I knew that the Jews had been banished from England, but were there Jews in Shakespeare's time? And it turns out there were. And so I'm writing about the conversos who fled Portugal, fled Spain, ended up in London, were hiding their faith. And of course, there's interaction with Shakespeare and the Globe Theater because I can't not.
That sounds wonderful. Sounds wonderful. Well, this has been really lovely, Michelle. Thank you so, so much. For everyone, I have put back at the end of the chat the Napoleon's Mirage, the link once again. Michelle, once again, thank you so much. So
If I could add just one small request, if
please.
you do read it, I'm currently standing at 13 reviews on Amazon. They're all 5-star reviews, which is very encouraging. But Amazon, when you get to 50, they start promoting it themselves. I'm a long way from 50. So please.
Will do.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Good to
Bye.
see you.
Thank you so much, Susan. You were
My
great.
pleasure.
Bye.
Have a good day, everybody.